The Oklahoma City Thunder just won a championship. They have 3 of the best players in the league, all under 27, all locked up for years. And this past offseason, they spent months trying to get rid of good players on purpose. That's not a mistake. That's not a rebuild. That's the second apron doing exactly what it was designed to do. Here's what this video is about. The NBA quietly built a rule so punishing that even the best teams in the league are now giving away solid, winning players just to survive it. Most fans think rules like this exist to punish bad teams, teams that overspend and blow up. But this one punishes winning. The better you build your roster, the faster this rule comes for you. I'm going to walk you through exactly how it works, why it's already hit real contenders in real ways, and what it's permanently changed about how every team in the league is built. And I'll save the nastiest part for later, because most people who think they understand this rule don't actually know the worst piece of it. Let's start with what the second apron actually is, because it gets confused with the luxury tax all the time, and they are not the same thing. The NBA has always had a soft cap. You spend over it, you pay a tax, you move on. Rich owners did that for 30 years, and it barely slowed them down. The higher a team's payroll rises above the tax line, the more those tax rates rise, so if a team is consistently going well above the line, it can expect to eventually pay hundreds of millions of dollars in taxes on top of its payroll commitments. That sounds painful, but the key word is pay. You could always just pay. Ownership groups with deep pockets treated it like a subscription fee for winning. Build the team you want, write the check, compete. The second apron is different. This luxury tax, second apron introduced in the 2023 NB, a collective bargaining agreement, did not just slow down team building, it fundamentally reshaped the league's middle class, and for the 2026-27 season, the second apron level sits at $221.686 million. Cross that line, and you don't just owe money, you lose tools. One by one, the things a front office normally uses to improve a roster just get switched off. Think of it like a menu. Every team in the league has a set of options they can use to build. Mid-level exceptions, trade aggregation, cash and deals, buyout signings. Cross the second apron, and that menu gets trimmed to almost nothing. Second apron teams cannot aggregate salaries in a trade, cannot send cash in any trade, cannot use any mid-level exception, and cannot sign a waived player whose prior contract topped the mid-level, so you're essentially locked into what you already have. And this wasn't an accident. In an effort to avoid super teams dominating the league, the NBA instituted the apron rule. The league looked at what happened with the Golden State Dynasty, looked at other stacked rosters that were being assembled, and built a machine specifically designed to prevent them. This is intentional demolition of payroll flexibility. Now let me show you why the tool stripping is more brutal than it sounds. Because there's one restriction in particular that fans almost never fully grasp. When a normal team wants to trade for a star player, they bundle contracts. Say you have a $10 million player and an $8 million player. You package them together and send them out to match the salary of an incoming $18 million guy. That's standard NBA trade logic. It's how most big deals get done. A second apron team cannot do that. Second apron teams cannot aggregate salaries in a trade. No combining 2 contracts to match one bigger one. Trades have to be 1 for 1, with the incoming salary not exceeding what goes out. So, if a star becomes available and you need to package 2 pieces to get him, you're done. You can't make the call. The roster just freezes in place. Think about what that means for a contender. You're a championship level team, your depth is solid, your core is locked in. But if a star comes available at the deadline, and you need to put together a real offer, you literally cannot do it. The rule doesn't just cost you money, it costs you the ability to react. So that's the tool stripping. No aggregation, no cash, no mid-level. That's the part most people know about. But here's the part most people don't. And this is the one that actually keeps front office executives up at night. When a team finishes a season above the second apron, their own first-round pick in the first draft, after the 7th following season, gets frozen and cannot be traded. Read that again. The league reaches 7 years into your future and locks your assets. You can't use that pick as trade currency. You can't package it to land a star. It just sits there, untouchable, for years. And it gets worse from there, because this is where it escalates into something genuinely brutal. Stay over the second apron in at least 2 of the next 4 seasons, and that frozen pick drops to the end of the first round. So you don't just lose the ability to trade the pick, you lose the pick's value entirely. It gets pushed to the last slot in the draft, regardless of how good or bad your team is. If your expensive roster ages, gets injured, and falls apart, you pay a fortune to lose games, and the league forces you to draft last anyway. The one thing that was supposed to save a sinking team, a high lottery pick, gets taken off the table. That's not a tax, that's a trap. And I want to be clear that this is not theoretical. This already happened to real teams. The Celtics, the Suns, and the Minnesota Timberwolves are the original members of the Second-Apron Club. All three exceeded the threshold in 2024 to 25, and not only paid $300 million in luxury tax penalties, but saw their 2032 first-round picks frozen. Boston won a championship in 2024. Minnesota was a conference finalist. These are legitimate, well-run franchises with real rosters, and their 2032 picks are already locked away. The Suns, Celtics, and Timberwolves will not be able to trade their 2032 first-round pick until 2028 at the earliest. That's the mega loop I mentioned at the top. The rule doesn't just punish you for spending, it punishes you for winning. And here's where OKC comes in, because the Thunder's situation this offseason is the clearest example of how this plays out in real time. OKC won the championship in 2025. They locked up Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, Chet Holmgren, and Jalen Williams. All told, they committed up to $822 million in new money to their three best players. That's what a franchise is supposed to do when it wins. You keep your guys. But those three massive contracts pushed the total payroll into second-apron territory, and suddenly, the team that just won it all had to start shedding the role players who helped them get there. The Thunder began their off-season roster maneuvering by trading shooting guard Aaron Wiggins to the Atlanta Hawks for a pair of second-round picks, a guy who was part of a championship roster, gone for draft picks because keeping him made the tax bill catastrophic. Oklahoma City shed significant coin from their payroll. Between the Isaiah Joe and Aaron Wiggins trades alone, they reduced their luxury tax penalty by $140 million. Here's why those numbers matter. You shed roughly $27 or $28 million in actual salary, but the tax savings multiply because of how the repeater tax works at those levels. They only shed around $20 million in actual salary through off-season trades, but doing so saved them roughly $200 million in payroll with the tax factored in. That's the math that's driving all of this. A small salary cut at the top of the tax scale is worth an enormous amount of money in avoided penalties. So teams aren't just trimming payroll, they're doing financial surgery, cutting players they want to keep, because the compounding cost of keeping them is simply too high. And if you're wondering whether this is changing how the whole league operates, yes, it absolutely is. Because when teams can't aggregate salaries, most contracts in the middle of the pay scale become nearly impossible to move. The second apron fundamentally reshaped the league's middle class. A player making $15 million used to be a tradable asset. Now, for a second apron team, that player is basically stuck on the roster because there's no mechanism to move him without a perfect one-for-one match. Front offices are starting to treat those contracts not as assets, but as long-term liabilities. The middle class of the NBA, the $12 to $22 million role player, is quietly being squeezed out. You're either a superstar on a max deal, or you're on a minimum. There's less and less room in between. Now, here's the closing piece, and this is the one that tells you how permanent this all is. Because teams above the second apron can't patch their bench mid-season, can't sign buyout players, can't use exceptions. The only reliable source of cheap, controllable labor left is the draft. The second apron introduced in the 2023 CBA did not just slow down team building, it fundamentally reshaped how the league's middle class is constructed. And the draft is now the one place teams can still get a young, cost-controlled player without triggering any of these restrictions. So front offices are treating every draft pick as precious, every rookie slot as a resource they can't afford to waste. Because once a player hits their second or third contract, the math gets dangerous fast. The chilling effect of all this is real. The 2026 to 27 second tax apron is set at $221.686 million. and currently only a handful of teams are projected to be above it, out of 30 franchises. Compare that to the old days when half the league happily wrote the luxury tax check and moved on. Teams aren't just being cautious, they're terrified, because once you cross the line and stay there, your draft pick 7 years out gets frozen, and repeat second-apron seasons can drop it to the end of the first round. The cost of building a dynasty now includes the possibility of losing the one tool you'd need to rebuild if that dynasty ever falls apart. That's the thesis. The NBA didn't just cap spending, it abolished the dynasty, or at least made building one so expensive and so structurally dangerous that almost no owner is willing to try. The second apron is the hard cap the NBA swore it would never create. It just doesn't call it that. Boston's 2032 pick is frozen. Minnesota's is frozen. OKC just traded away championship contributors to avoid the same fate, and the rule is only getting more familiar to more teams every season. If you want to understand how this is already reshaping the actual trade market this year, which teams have leverage, which ones are stuck, and why certain stars might be available for almost nothing, that's exactly what the next video covers. It's worth watching back to back with this one, and if you've got a take on whether the second apron is actually good for the league, or whether it's just punishing smart teams for being good at their jobs, drop it in the comments. Genuinely curious where people land on this one. Subscribe if you want to keep up with this stuff, because the CBA angles are only going to get more interesting as more teams get trapped.